Hello everyone, trust you all are doing good. So viewers, many of us have been flabbergasted by the visuals coming from Russia's missile attacks on Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian schools, hospitals and other critical infrastructure. The Russia-Ukraine war has entered the 10th month. It's almost a year. And the footage of blown up buildings and devastated cities leave behind some questions. What will be the cost of rebuilding Ukraine? And more importantly, who is going to foot the bill? Unnerving estimates of global economic contraction have been in news all along. In my previous article for ThePrint, I described the worrying process of deindustrialization that Europe is undergoing because of the war and the unsustainably high energy prices. But the situation in Ukraine is literally critical. World Bank has projected Ukraine's economy to contract by a 45% this year. And amid this gloom comes yet another challenge. Economic catastrophes bring in their wake a wide spectrum of destruction. Waiting in the wings of a withering economy could be Ukraine's collapsing governance, which sooner than later will perpetuate the disruption of its societal fabric. And given the scale of continuing destruction, this scenario could only be a few months away. Now, intuitively, the situation sounds counterproductive to the humongous financial and military assistance being sent by the West. The aid must mean something beyond helping Ukraine fight the war. The billions of dollars cannot lie under the debris of destruction. They must be aiming to rebuild Ukraine whenever it happens. So, does the West have a plan of action? What are the options being weighed? And what roadblocks are likely to emerge along the way of rebuilding Ukraine? Although it is really difficult to precisely estimate how expensive it will be to rebuild Ukraine because the war is still going on, the latest cost is touted at over $1 trillion. But the most baffling part is that this expenditure to rebuild Ukraine is only slated to rise because the war is stretching on. How can we then assess the current aid packages? Since the war has started, West has been sending staggering amounts of broadly three kinds of aid to Ukraine: macro-financial aid, military aid, and humanitarian aid. United States has sent a total of about $68 billion in aid. Biden administration has recently asked Congress for yet another $38 billion in the proposed budget for 2024. The US, UK and Poland have emerged as the major providers of military support to Ukraine. And much of the financial aid, however, is coming from the European Union and Canada. But taken together, it is just about enough to keep Ukraine's government afloat. Grandiose posturing aside, these proposals, like the White House's I just explained, do not furnish the resources required to either counter the drain of the war on Ukraine's economy or save it from the impending societal disintegration I described a few minutes ago. To what tune then is Ukraine's economic requirement? President Zelensky recently proclaimed that Kyiv needs an estimated $7 billion monthly in support to even continue fighting for its survival. Far more substantial aid and sustained support will be required to stave off a defeat. And then getting the economy back on track and the eventual rebuilding of the country's destroyed civilian and critical infrastructure will be even more astoundingly expensive. So while this rebuilding load will have to be shared among the Western allies, but the West is also keen on making Russia foot the bill for its destruction of Ukraine. So this brings us to the question of war reparations, which is politically and emotionally a rather loaded term. You see, hypothetically, a classic reparation mechanism kicks in after a country is clearly and decisively defeated in war. Think of the First World War or the Second World War and the reparation mechanisms that came after that. By contrast, clear victory has been elusive to either side in the Russia-Ukraine context. And then we also don't know how long the war will go on. Under such a situation, it would be a brazen oversight to ascribe defeat to any side just as the war is entering its winter phase. The United Nations General Assembly, voted by a large majority, recently passed a resolution to set up a mechanism for reparations by Russia. And by the way, in this particular voting, India had abstained. However, the UN mechanism is not going to be effective beyond its symbolic value because of the veto impasse at the Security Council. Russia and China hold a veto, and Russia definitely is going to veto any decision that is going against Russian core interests. How then to work around this reparation pathway? And how will the West make Russia pay for the reparations? Now, while some consensus has emerged among the EU27 on this matter, which was recently voiced by the European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, the European Union wants to hold Russia accountable for the estimated $600 billion of damage it has caused in Ukraine. Finding ways and means to make Russia pay the reparations has been around since a couple of months after the war started, which is around April this year. More specifically, as the SWIFT sanctions, I hope you remember, the SWIFT sanctions entered into force, lot of analysis has centered around the long-term feasibility of the freeze. For instance, what exactly is West going to do with the frozen assets? Can they really be confiscated? See, there are two kinds of frozen assets that may be confiscated. The public assets, that is the foreign reserves that alone make up to almost 340 billion US dollars. And second, the private assets of the Russian oligarchs that might add another 30 billion to that pool. But finding a modus operandi to confiscate and then liquidate these assets is easier said than done. Without necessary legislative reform, it will be rather daunting to actually liquidate the value of the sanctioned assets. See, if you look at the West, currently it is only Canada which has already done this through the C-19 bill and is now working with G7 allies to craft new legislation that would allow for not just the freezing of sanctioned Russian assets, but their seizure on behalf of Ukrainian war victims. But what about the big players? The United States, the European Union and the UK. Let's start with UK. UK, for once, is mired in its own economic challenges, and despite welcoming the idea of a coordinated confiscation of Russian assets, there has been hardly any progress on the ground, and understandably so. Rishi Sunak has just come, they have to save their economy first. Now, coming to the US, there have been calls in the US legislature to move from freezing to seizing those assets to fund the eventual reconstruction of Ukraine. Janet Yellen, the governor of the US Federal Reserve, has warned of the probable seismic impact of confiscating Russia's vast dollar holdings, the 340 billion. Her logic draws on the bankability of the US dollar as the international reserve currency. What she's saying is that it would discourage countries like China or anyone else from future reliance on dollars as reserve currencies for fear of confiscation, lest a situation of this magnitude arises. That would be a blow to America's dominance of the world order, the idea which is encapsulated by the phrase Pax Americana. But the group that supports confiscation of Russian assets, however, has argued that the reputation and bankability of the US dollar would not suffer so long as political coordination among allies remains steady. But disjunction in policy decisions for dollars and euros might render the coordinated arrangements nugatory and trigger speculation and wariness among asset investors. So, what is the way out? If allies could ensure that swap lines would remain functional, banks would not have a problem going about business as usual, and assets would remain safe. The bottom line of this argument is, if this is to work, the West must remain united. But Coordination itself does not guarantee what the West wants. The biggest legal hurdle is that states' assets enjoy immunity from execution under international law. Therefore, current international legal law makes it impossible to advance on this course. Without a precedent, there is currently no clear answer to how to break this impasse. But those in favor of confiscating Russian assets argue on the premise of what is called state countermeasures for wrongful state action. What it means in simple terms is that it will have to be shown that the property's monetary worth is linked with criminal activity. A precedent does exist in the internationally imposed decisions after the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. These precedents must be adapted to the circumstances in Ukraine. So, does that mean that declaring Russia a terrorist state will help? Partially, in terms of making it pay for war reparations, but it will simultaneously open a Pandora's box in terms of how to negotiate with a terrorist state on several existential concerns, such as, for example, cooperation to prevent weaponization of outer space or negotiating the New START treaty, among similar things. Fathomably, while the EU, owing to its largely economic relations with Russia, is up for declaring Russia a terrorist state, the United States, realizing that the costs will outweigh the benefits, is not. Therefore, to prove Russia's wrongdoings without declaring it a terrorist state would require a different type of a novel legislature with many Gordian knots. Now, let us look at what does the EU plan. The European Union is also proposing to confiscate the frozen Russian assets and use them to finance the costly reconstruction of Ukraine. The plan, which is about reinvesting the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank, is challenging again. You know why? Because it does not have a precedent. At present, EU countries cannot confiscate private assets just because those assets have been targeted under EU sanctions. So, quite like the US, the EU nations can also use a criminal conviction or a criminal association involving the owner in order to expropriate that property. And, like I said, that also explains the EU's readiness to declare Russia a terrorist state, but then the US does not want it. What does this situation tell us about the emerging contours of a likely negotiation then? Confiscating and liquidating Russian assets may be more arduous than the optimists claim. Nonetheless, in the West's calculus, it is also about creating pressure on Russia to bring them to the negotiating table in due course. President Putin has tried to project a nonchalant attitude, pegged on capital controls and surging energy prices, implying that the sanctions regime will have little impact on the Russian economy or Russian energy sales. And partly it's been true in the short run. But the recent decision by the Russian parliament, which is called the Duma, to yet again raise taxes on its oil and gas companies twice in 2 months, last time they did it, I think it was September, tells a rather different story. Russia needs the money to keep its war in Ukraine going. The pressure on President Putin is palpable. The revenue Russia is earning from energy sales is not sanctioned yet, but the tide might turn since the payments are deposited in banks that are located in the West. Let's assume a scenario where the revenues are not sanctioned directly, but freight and cargo companies are. Such indirect sanctions would also hurt Moscow significantly, despite Russia resorting to newer markets like China, India, and Turkey. So, how risk-averse can Russia afford to be? Does this mean that the complicated mazes of confiscating frozen Russian assets or negotiations around their likely unfreezing could lead to the long-awaited peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine? If transpired, it will help sort the tangled deliberations on Russia's role in war reparations to some extent. When and if that happens, credible players like India from the world stage will definitely have a role to play. Now, whether India is able to leverage its cordial and friendly relations with both the belligerent camps while also chairing the G20, where the West as well as Russia are both members, will certainly be a test for India's pragmatic diplomacy. That does seem a long way to go, but before that, I will be back soon again to unravel another interesting vertical of geopolitics. Stay tuned.